Hello, in this video I'm going to present you some differences that affect the English and Spanish learning. Some of those differences that difficult the English and Spanish learning vary on between pronunciation and grammatical structures. Conjugation. In Spanish, we have many kinds to conjugate a verb. One of the most obvious differences that we find is that in Spanish, the last syllable or letter of a verb changed according to the conjugation and the subject. For example, in English, the verb to work in present simple is conjugated like this: I work, you work, he or she works, we work, they work. But in Spanish, the verb trabajar in present simple is conjugated like this: yo trabajo, tú trabajas, él o ella trabaja, nosotros trabajamos, vosotros trabajáis, ellos trabajan. Here, we can see that in Spanish, the verb changed in the last syllable or the last letter according to the subject. Subject. In English, we always have the necessity to put the subject in a sentence. Without a subject, the sentence is not coherent, but in Spanish, we can omit the subject without losing the coherence in the sentence. For example, in English, we must say, I was studying when my mother came to the house with a big chocolate cake. And in Spanish, we could say, yo estaba estudiando cuando mi mamá llegó a casa con un gran pastel de chocolate. Or, estaba estudiando cuando mi mamá llegó a casa con un gran pastel de chocolate. Stress. In English, we stress syllables. In Spanish, we stress vowels, and we put a diacritical mark over the vowel. For example, in English, they, geographic, television, photography, and politician. These 5 words have stress. In Spanish, we say día, geográfico, televisión, fotografía, and político. These 5 words have stress that is marked with a diacritical mark over the vowel. Grammatical order. Adjectives. In English, the order of a sentence with an adjective is based on this pattern: subject plus verb plus adjective plus noun. But in Spanish, we can put the adjective before or after the noun. For example, in English, you must say, I love my beautiful house, not I love my house beautiful. But in Spanish, we could say, yo amo mi hermosa casa, or yo amo mi casa hermosa. Use of the auxiliary do. In English, we use the auxiliary do to form yes/no questions and negative statements. For example, do you play tennis? No, I don't play tennis. But in Spanish, we don't use auxiliaries to form closed questions or negative statements. For example, ¿te gusta el tenis? No, no me gusta el tenis. Gender. In English, the nouns don't have gender, on the contrary to Spanish, where some nouns are masculine or feminine. For example, the teacher. In Spanish, la profesora o el profesor. The house. In Spanish, la casa. The bunny. In Spanish, la coneja, el conejo. The car. In Spanish, el carro. The assistant. In Spanish, la asistente o el asistente. Possessive case. In English, we use the possessive case to introduce the possession of something. This possessive case omits the use of the preposition of. For example, the Sarah's book. But in Spanish, we don't have this possessive case. On the contrary, we use the preposition de to introduce the possession of something. For example, el libro de Sara. Phrase classification. In Spanish, we have 5 ways to classify a sentence: frases nominales, frases adjetivas, frases preposicionales, frases verbales, and frases adverbiales. On the contrary to English, that have 10 ways to classify a phrase: verb phrase, prepositional phrase, participial phrase, infinitive phrase, gerund phrase, absolute phrase, noun phrase, appositive phrase, adverbial phrase, and adjectival phrase. Unimembre and bimembre sentences are sentences that we only found in Spanish as a category. For example, lápiz en punta is a unimembre sentence. That means a sentence without a verb. And mi peinado afro is a bimembre sentence. That means a sentence with only one verb. Demonstrative pronouns. Both languages have demonstrative pronouns. The difference is that in English we have 4 demonstrative pronouns: this, that, this, those. On the contrary to Spanish, that have 15 demonstrative pronouns. With the Spanish demonstrative pronouns, we need to take account that each pronoun are used according to the gender and number. For example, este es un carro, estos carros, esta flor, estas flores, esto es blanco. Ese camión, esos camiones, esa casa, esas casas, eso es rosado. Aquel parque, aquellos parques, aquella blusa, aquellas blusas, aquello es amarillo. But in English, they smell good, that sound good, these are t-shirts, those are my parents. Demonstrative adjectives. In English, the demonstrative adjectives and the demonstrative pronouns are the same. The difference between both is the use. For example, this car is so cheap. That car is cheap. These books are so heavy. Those books are so heavy. In Spanish, the demonstrative adjectives and pronouns are almost the same, but these have 2 differences: the use and the lack of the diacritical mark placed over the vowels. For example, este carro, estos carros son muy rápidos, esta flor es un lirio, estas flores son lirios, ese es el libro de Juan, esos libros son de Juan, esa casa es hermosa, esas casas son hermosas, aquel parque es muy divertido, aquellos parques son muy divertidos, aquella blusa es azul, aquellas blusas son azules. Prepositions in, on, and at. In English, we have 3 prepositions of place. Each of these prepositions have a different use. For example, at is used with common places, specific places, and durations. For example, at home at Madison Square Garden. In is used to indicate countries, cities, rooms, water bodies, weather, some places, and expressions. For example, in Spain, in New York, in the bedroom, in a river, in the sun, in a mirror. On is used to indicate surface, transport, body parts, directions, and some places. For example, on the list, on a train, on your arms, on the left, on the radio. But in Spanish, we have 1 preposition that has the same meaning of the 3 English prepositions of place. This preposition is en. For example, en la casa, en New York, en España, en la radio. Homophone words. In English and in Spanish, we have the same difficulty with the homophone words. Some common homophone words in English are: on the right, I write; in the sea, I see; My son, the sun. Where are you? You wear a jacket. And in Spanish, ay, me duele. En mi casa hay un gato. Yo amo las bayas. Vaya a la cocina. Me encanta asar carne. Él ganó por azar. ¿Qué hora es? Él ora. Indefinite articles. In both languages, we have the indefinite articles, but in English, we use the articles an when the noun begins with a vowel. For example, an apple, an animal. Another difference is that in Spanish we have masculine and feminine articles, on the contrary to English, where the articles don't have gender. For example, we use una for feminine words in Spanish, una manzana, una cabra, and we use un for masculine words, un color, un cuaderno. Definite articles. In Spanish, we have two definite articles, el and la. Each one represents the gender of the noun. For example, el camello, el carro, y la casa, la locomotora. On the contrary to English, when we have one definite articles, the animal, the house. Future tenses. Will. How I said before, Spanish has different forms to conjugate a verb, on the contrary to English that use auxiliary verbs to conjugate a verb. For example, in Spanish we conjugate a verb in the future like this: yo te enviaré un regalo, él estará aquí 2 días más, tú jugarás tenis. But in English we use will to create a future tense. I will send you a present, he will stay here 2 days more, you will play tennis. You can see that in Spanish we modified the last letters of a verb to create a future tense. You. In English, we have the pronoun you to make reference to the second singular subject and the third plural subject, but in Spanish, it's necessary to pluralize the pronoun to make correct sentence. For example, in English, we say, you are my father, you are from Spain, you are a couple. But in Spanish, we say, tú eres mi padre, usted es de España, ustedes son pareja. Pronunciation. The letter ñ. In Spanish, we have the letter ñ, but in English, this letter doesn't exist. The ñ sound is pronounced a little bit like an an with a hum, and we can find this sound in words like a canyon in English. And in Spanish, we can find this sound and this letter in words like a niño, señorita, baño, mañana, señor. The double R. The double R sound is very difficult for English speakers, but it's important to recognize this sound because in Spanish there are many words with this letter. For example, in Spanish we find carro, perro, error, correr, cerrar. The double L. The double L can be pronounced in a variety of ways, and we can find it in words like llama, callar, llanura, llovía, and llanta in Spanish. But we can find the double L in English, but it's not pronounced like in Spanish. For example, fall, volume, ballad, college, and dollar. The S sound at the beginning of a word. For Spanish speakers, one difficulty at the moment to learn English is that in Spanish we have the tendency to prefix the words beginning with a consonant cluster on S with an E sound. For example, we say school and see school, Snack instead snack. Smash instead smash. Failure to pronounce the last consonant. The Spanish speakers have difficulties to pronounce the last consonant. For example, we say cart instead car, bridge instead bridge, and thin instead think.